Annual Commencement Day Lecture to be delivered by Professor Abhijit Banerjee, Ford Foundation, International Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. My name is Nirmit Ved and I will be your MC this evening. May I now request our Managing Director, Mr. David Raskina, to please come up and deliver his welcome address.
Professor Abhijit Banerjee, distinguished invitees, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to all of you this evening for Exim Bank's 34th Commencement Day Annual Lecture. A particular warm welcome to some of our senior colleagues at Exim Bank who have joined us, Ms. Tajini Vakil, who led the bank with great distinction in the 90s, our former executive directors, Mr. N. Shankar, our senior colleagues, Mr. Chitnavis, Mr. Ukaboy, Mr. S.R. Rao, our Executive Director, Mr. T.V. Rao. Thank you for remembering and joining the family of Eximites as always. A very warm welcome to the number of dignitaries and great guests of ours who have been with us over the many years of the Commencement Day Lecture. If you cast your mind back, you'll recall that the Commencement Day Lecture was instituted in 1986 as a means of commemorating the setting up of the Exim Bank 4 years earlier. It is in many ways a stern inquiry, an attempt to foster dialogue, to ask questions, and to generate answers to topics that are of relevance to international economics, international trade, international finance, and of course, most important of all, based here in India. Last year in this very same venue, we had the honor of having with us Professor Geeta Gopinath, the John Zwanstra Professor of Economics, to talk to us. And interestingly, almost exactly 1 year after her lecture, she has just taken charge as the Chief Economist at the International Monetary Fund. Today we have the signal honor of having with us Professor Abhijit Banerjee, who has a distinguished career in the field of development economics, and he will be speaking to us today on a theme which is of great topical interest to India, that is redesigning social policy. Why is this a topic of such great interest to us today? India is undoubtedly one of the fastest growing large economies of its size in the world. Over the last 25 years, the average growth rate of the economy has been hovering around 7%. The change in the economy, for those of you who have white hair like me, is dramatic from the 60s and the 70s to where we have reached today. The economy is much more diversified. We are much more interlinked with the international world in terms of our international trade. We can hold our heads high as a respected country in the world today. There have been a large number of reform measures, not just starting in the 90s, but in the last few years, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, the Goods and Services Tax, and many more. Nevertheless, we face challenges going ahead. With all our growth, if one looks on a per capita basis, India remains one of the poorest countries among the G20, which doesn't quite correspond with the otherwise illustrious position we have in the G20. Growth has not been uniform either. The levels of inequality in the Indian economy have grown. Incomes of the top 5% have grown much faster than the incomes of the remaining 95%. And it is essential that while we cannot and should not attempt to end all inequality, but we do need to make life easier for those at the bottom of the pyramid and see what difficulties that they face. In this regard, reform of social policy becomes of critical importance, and I can think of no other better person to help us in understanding this subject than Professor Banerjee. I'm sure many of you here are well familiar with Professor Banerjee's illustrious career, but for those of you who are not, let me highlight a few aspects. Professor Banerjee is currently the Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is the co-founder and director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Laboratory in MIT. Professor Banerjee was initially educated at the University of Calcutta, then the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and went on to obtain his PhD from Harvard University. He has served as the president of the Bureau for Research in Economic Analysis of Development. He was also the recipient of many awards, including, importantly, the inaugural Infosys Prize in 2009. Dr. Banerjee is also listed among the top next generation of Indian intellectuals and brightest minds identified by the biggest names in Indian intelligentsia, a report which came out just a week ago, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with the names on that list. He has also been an honorary consultant at the Planning Commission of India in 2008. He has served as a member of the United Nations High-Level Panel on the post-2015 Development Agenda. Many of you will also recall that Dr. Banerjee was one of the leading lights of the group of 13 prominent economists, including Dr. Raghuram Rajan and our last year's speaker, Professor Geeta Gopinath, who came up with an economic strategy for India in December 2018. This strategy outlines a development agenda for the country over the next 5 years, setting out some of the key challenges. It also outlines a number of key proposals with the intent of spurring constructive debate and discussion. Among other things, it propounds de-risking India's external sector, which is heavily dependent on oil imports, thereby resulting in boom-bust cycles, not only in the domestic economy, but in our international trade. A systematic program to hedge global crude prices, attracting more FDI, disincentivizing hot money, and so on. Dr. Banerjee is also a prolific author. He has undertaken a large quantity of research work focusing on economic development and income distribution. Some of his books are Handbook of Field Experiments, Making Aid Work, Understanding Poverty, Volatility and Growth, and most important of all, a book which I'm sure is familiar to most of us here, Poor Economics. Poor Economics, which was received with great applause around the world, is an interesting look at the problems of poverty from within the ranks of the poor using the results of the Poverty Action Laboratory rather than the ivory tower that many of the rest of us otherwise inhabit. Ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a pleasure and an honor for us to have Professor Abhijit Banerjee at the 34th Exim Bank Annual Day Lecture. Let me once again welcome all of you and thank you for joining us this evening. And I would request Professor Banerjee, if I can give the floor to you, all of us are most eager to hear you.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here in this beautiful hotel, in this beautiful room, speaking to this distinguished company. It's on a really stunning day in Bombay. So I apologize for cheating you for the pleasure of being outside. So what I want to speak about is sort of a perspective on social policy. This is a good time to do so. There's elections, perhaps for good reasons and bad, bring forth a lot of interest in social policy and also a temptation to make social policy without, in a sense, thinking about it. So it's a good time to plant thoughts, and that's all I'll be able to do. I like most people of my kind, have very limited influence on what actually happens in the world, but I think it's often useful as an exercise to understand what, if you had all the political druthers that you would like to have, what would you like to do? So I'm going to start with that presumption. Of course, reality often intrudes, and not everything, or maybe not anything of what I'm going to propose will become policy, but I think it's good to understand where things need to be and how that relates to where we are now. So I think just to set the stage, I think we have a general frame for doing economic policy in India. The frame was mostly designed when India was one of the poorest countries in the world. It's, and I think we came out of a period of starvation and famines, and rightly, I think we designed our social policy around combating those famines. We didn't really have, our private sector was small. The government, with good reason and often bad, had little faith in it. And the economy was highly controlled and almost closed. So that's a world where we designed our social policy. And it's worth reflecting back on where we are now as an economy and how that might change the way we think about social policy. In that context, where starvation and famine were the primary threats, it made sense for the main redistributive tool to be the public distribution system. It prevented starvation. It made sense for the government to create a whole infrastructure to procure, transport, and sell grains, since the private sector could not be relied upon to do so. So we have the Food Corporation of India and an entire machinery that goes with it was set up partly because the government didn't expect to be able to procure grain at the point where it was delivering grain. So it was very much a view that, let's not trust the market. And second, there was no, I think there's a lot of, very serious constraints on foreign exchange, and so importing was not a constraint. So it was not an option. So it was entirely going to be domestic. Domestic production will be then moved from Punjab to Odisha and from Odisha to Maharashtra, and that's what the government will deliver. It also made sense for the government to provide education and healthcare, and within that to focus on the saving the lives of mothers and children and getting children into schools. So not focus on what they learn, but on the fact that they are in school. So these were all the right priorities of their time. I think that I'm going to criticize these, but I entirely recognize that there was a time and a place where these made sense. I think a reset is long overdue. We are a lower middle income country with a host of new problems. And part of the reason we have these problems, I want to emphasize, is because we solved the old problems. That's part of that comes with a new set of terrains and a new set of problems. And I think where we are, we partially recognize some of these problems. It's not that everything is sort of, what I'm going to say is so desperately original that you never heard them. There's some idea that these problems exist, but I think some of it is quite inconvenient, so it's easy to ignore. And a lot of it is just seen as somehow still, this is at the margin. That this is the central problematic is what we used to have 30 years ago, and we have and then we need to adjust it. I want to argue that it's really not a matter of adjustment. It's a matter of reset. We need to start from we are in a different place. We need to start from a different set of premises and create a framework for social policy that's more a response to where we are now. And in particular, it is what that does not constitute is adding some more schemes. I mean, our base strategy for fixing social problems is to introduce new scheme after new scheme. There are, in fact, just in this anti-poverty area, more than 400 schemes, though if you asked anyone in GOI to name them, they couldn't do so. We only know that because the World Bank at some point started counting them. And as a result, we actually have some sense of what is a minimum list. They don't know every one, but they know that there are at least 400. So that's a lot of schemes, a lot of government offices, a lot of small amounts of money assigned to different initiatives, a lot of our limited governance capacity kind of assigned to it. And I think that's not where we need to go. I think we need to be picking priorities for now and moving on those priorities. So I'm going to discuss actually, this slide is wrong, 5 critical issues that I think we are getting at least partially, and perhaps mostly wrong. So before I come to that, I want to say some general guiding ideas on what's the organization behind these. First, I think I want to start by assuming, I think those of you who work here will recognize that state capacity is a very scarce resource, maybe much more scarce than money even. It's easier to throw money at a problem than to throw state capacity, especially because we don't have mechanisms for growing state capacity. We really are much more hobbled in that than we are in growing the economy. The economy grows, the state capacity really stays the same. Resources are scarce. In addition to state capacity, we need to raise our tax collection, especially of direct taxes. We need to broaden our tax base. We've kind of kept our tax base is roughly the same as it was 25 years ago. The proportion of GDP, our tax base for direct taxation has not expanded. So we are sort of where we were 25 years ago. Better enforcement has improved, but not nearly as much as you would want to. I think we have really no idea. I mean, if you look at the mismatch between what we think should be the tax collection based on the size of the economy and what we collect, that remains very large. And given this scarcity of resources, we also face, I mean, there was this estimate of, and remember, $3 trillion is what we need to invest in just our cities. So just the magnitude of the resource crunch is massive. I think given all this, a thought I'm going to leave you with, but not really elaborate on, is that I think we risk falling into what is sometimes called as a middle income trap. Countries which grow up to a point, but then don't go any further. We have, as David said in his introduction, we're growing very fast, but I'm not sure we know why we're growing very fast. We are growing. We have certainly if you look at global measures, our human capital is really not high quality. Our infrastructure is not high quality. Our environment is getting increasingly poisoned. And we grow despite them, not because of them. I think we could, I could spend lots of time talking about this, but I think part of the reason we do grow is because we have so much misallocation, so many distortions that those create opportunities. And I think those opportunities, we have lots of entrepreneurial talent, people take it up. But once you take that as your starting point, you start worrying that once those rather egregious opportunities run out, we may slow down very fast. And this is not the first country where it would have happened. If you think of Brazil between 1961 and 1980, Brazil was one of the fastest growing countries in the world, growing at, 9%, I think, for that entire period. It stops growing in 1980 and really never restarts. So it can happen very fast, and it happened almost over the course of a year and then never restarted. Japan is a very similar story. Growth can stop very fast. So I want to, my point is not to throw the fear of God into you, or you and all of us, but to say that, there is no sense in which we should be grateful for the growth, but we shouldn't take it as given. And we should need to think of, not just of fixing our economic structure, not just because it is good for the less advantaged people, but because we want to keep growing. So with that, let me step into my main topics. So education. Education has been a place where we actually have achieved some remarkable things. In fact, things that we did not expect to achieve. In the mid-90s, we were still talking about all the children who don't go to school because their parents will not send them because they're of child labor. Basically, all children in India except in some very specific areas, are in school. All children around under 12 are in school. And there's almost no difference between boys and girls. And that's now increasingly true, that there's a very large fraction of them go on to be even in secondary school. So this is very good news, and I don't want to say otherwise. But I think they're not learning much. More than half of fifth graders are at second grade level in math, and likewise in their vernacular language. And perhaps more depressingly, this doesn't improve. Those who fall behind in class 2 are even further behind in class 5 and even further behind in class 8. So it's a very, very stable trajectory of falling behind. Our PISA scores, which is the one internationally comparable test that we did participate in once, were so bad that the government of India blocks participation in it, and then complains that when the World Bank says that our human capital is worse than that of Bangladesh, it's using the PISA numbers. The PISA numbers from 2009. It's true they're using the numbers from 2009, but there are no new numbers because the government doesn't allow us to participate in it, which is a somewhat odd way to reason to complain. Now, here's a place where I think the diagnosis is fundamentally wrong. We have the Right to Education Act. The Right to Education Act is a very explicit diagnosis of what the problem is and what the solution is. The diagnosis is that we need better infrastructure, better paid teachers, and more teacher training. So teachers need to be trained more, and this is what's going to fix our education system. There's actually none of this appears to be true. Our teachers are among the best paid in the world relative to per capita GDP. Teachers are paid 50,000, 60,000 rupees. It's very hard to find teachers' jobs. People are desperate to get these jobs because they are wonderful jobs. Low work hours, large, good pay, good benefits. There is a field experiment, a large-scale experiment where they randomly chose schools in Indonesia and doubled teachers' salaries. They had zero effect on test scores. So I'm also not optimistic from that point of view. And there are many, many studies of improving infrastructure in school and doubling training. Many of these studies are very carefully done to generate credible results. And I think the first order fact is they find no impact. It's very hard to get any test score impacts of improving school infrastructure, providing more blackboards, etc. The alternative diagnosis, which also you hear a lot in India, is that we need more incentives. And in a sense, this is happening. 50% of children in many states are now in private schools. And I think that private schools are, interestingly, the first factor, and one well-established factor of private schools is that private schools are much cheaper than government schools. You know, the amount of money that you spend per child in a government school system is something between 2 to 5 times what you would spend in the private school system. So they're much cheaper. On the other hand, unfortunately, there is a nice study in India, in Andhra Pradesh, which is one of the states where the school systems work relatively well, actually, where it's a random group of children, large number of children, thousands of children, were given vouchers to go to private school, and those children were chosen at random, so they were comparable to other children, and they looked at what happened to their test scores. And the answer is nothing. So these private schools are just as bad as the government schools. They are cheaper, so maybe that's one reason to favor them. The Right to Education Act, of course, picks exactly that, which is that they don't like the idea that the private schools are cheaper, so they want private schools to pay these teachers more, get more qualified teachers, and build more infrastructure in the schools, none of which we have promised to do anything to the quality of teaching, will make the private schools go out of business. So the particular the Right to Education Act is kind of a perverse attempt to undermine, I think, this move to private schooling, and partly it's been successful. Some the people, nobody actually knows the number, but I've heard the number like 10,000 schools have been shut down because of the Right to Education Act. Private schools are being shut down because they don't meet the infrastructure requirement, but there's no particular reason to believe that this is going to solve one way or the other. I mean, the Right to Education Act at best will not solve the problem of quality of education, and worst will actually do damage. So, and here I think we have done lots of work in the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, and I think the answer is very clear. The real problem is a colonial model of teaching. We set an absolute standard set by the syllabus, irrespective of the child's background and the teacher's capacity to teach it. Children get lost, and once lost are offered no help to catch up. If you ask teachers why they don't help the children, they say these are weak children, implying often that the children are hopelessly lost. There is a former HRD minister at the center told me, I don't believe in no child left behind. In so many words, in other words, there has to be absolute standards in schools where, in a context where many of the children are first-generation literates, where their parents are not in a place to help them, the syllabus is God, you follow syllabus, and if people fall behind the syllabus, it's their fault, they're weak, maybe their background is not appropriate for schooling. So that particular hierarchical attitude, inherited from our colonial masters and seen through the lens of the caste system, no doubt, it doesn't help us in getting out of this problem. So we have lots and lots of evidence, many of these large-scale field experiments in maybe in 7 states where we found in each case, if you actually teach at the right level, meaning you teach the child what he needs to know, children catch up very fast. The reason why we don't improve our education is because we decide not to do it, not because it's not possible to do it. These experiments have often used unpaid volunteers who've been trained 3 days. They go to the schools, they teach for 3 months, and the children make more progress than they make over 2 years in the school system. So the magnitude of this distortion is kind of mind-boggling in a sense, because we have an easy solution which we don't implement, and then we do all kinds of things that actually don't help. We also, and just to sort of reassure us, there is actually nice evidence now from Delhi, where what they do is they look at preschool children before they get into school children, and look at can they solve the kind of math problems that are instinctive and don't require any math. And they find that these children in the slums of Delhi perform just as well as the children living around Harvard University, who are children of the PhD students at Harvard. So our children don't lack talent, they lack something else. And that's what they lack, is a school system that works with them. So on this one, I think we kind of know the answer. I think we should, then this at least part of the answer. I think we need to remove all input requirements in the Right to Education Act. We need to replace it by an outcome-based regulation. All children should have some basic skills. Until grade 6, there should be a focus only on basic skills. It doesn't matter if they learn history or learn to chant, they write slokas or not. They should just focus on math and reading. They need to move to, and I think we should certainly think of moving to a vouchers, shrink the government schooling system, since nobody really wants to go to government schools. And schools are states are doing this. Many schools are empty now. So Madhya Pradesh is shrinking schools. They are taking schools and moving children to other schools nearby. Some children are dropping out as a result, but the quality of the teaching seems to be improving. So that's one thing we need to do. And we need to just, once we recognize that the government school system is shrinking, we need to downscale it, cut back on the hiring. pour more money into secondary schools, where I think we are short of good teachers, especially in the sciences. So I think I think that particular program will certainly help. Healthcare, we're heading into an NCD crisis, a non-communicable disease crisis. The reason, this is partly, as I said before, some of this is a result of success. The particular success we have is people are living longer. The reason you get, the first order predictor of getting non-communicable diseases like cancer is that you live till you are 55 or 60 or 65. That's what's happening, that's good news. But then we are going to have many more of these people. Then we have our diet, the fact that very few people exercise. You take all of this, we know that we have among the world's biggest burdens of diabetes, blood pressure, and a bunch of other lifestyle diseases. And those are going to be extremely expensive to deal with. They will reduce productivity, and they will make us make people spend lots of money and effort. We're also making, so childhood malnutrition interacts with this. People who were very malnutrition in childhood, if they get nutrition later, tend to be people who seem to have a higher proclivity to get certain types of lifestyle diseases. So the fact that you start by being undernutrited actually hurts you even in the longer run. And we are, malnutrition, childhood malnutrition is something where we're making progress, but not very fast progress, and antibiotics resistance is rising. So these are all threats to our health which we are facing. Given that, it's a bit odd that our focus right now is on tertiary care. The Ayushman Bharat scheme, which is the big scheme, flagship scheme of this government on healthcare, is entirely a way of defraying the cost of tertiary care, which is not a bad thing. It's very expensive. Tertiary care, once you have to be in a hospital to get a kidney transplant, that's very, very expensive, and some way of reducing that cost is a good thing. But it's not going to solve the problem of health. It's going to solve the problem of spending. And that's not, and I think that there is a sense in which this is this maybe I'm in the interest of going a little faster, I'm going to skip, but I don't think we've done the homework on how to implement Ayushman Bharat. If you remember, RSBY, which is its parent program, had to be shut down in some states because there was so much fraud. And I don't think we have actually done the homework of dealing with it. But, this is not to say that this is not it's not a reasonable goal to insure people against large expenses. We need to do our homework and do it well, but it's not going to improve health or substantially. What will improve health is better primary care. And where do we get, that's where I think we hit a real constraint. The problem is that most of our healthcare is delivered by people who we pretend don't exist. These are people who are practitioners of health who have no medical qualifications, or some qualifications that don't actually permit them to practice allopathic medicine. They all practice allopathic medicine. You can see these numbers. Average village has 3.5 providers with no degree, and 1 in 5 villages has an MBBS. So most villages don't have MBBS providers. Therefore, and most of the care is provided by them. So most of these people are practicing medicine illegally. There's no way to engage with them because they're not supposed to exist. And yet, when you go, and the only person you are usually, unless you are really sick, the only person you really consult is one of these people. So the only person who can check your blood pressure and say your blood pressure is really high, you should go see somebody, is one of these people. The only person who can check your blood sugar and say your blood sugar is extremely dangerous is one of these people. So if we don't talk to those people, we are essentially cutting the one arm off which reaches out to these people. So given that, again, I would say we should recognize the presence of these providers. We regulate them by frequent tests of competence. There are ways in which we can test them and say that, you know, if you are doing egregiously bad things, then, or you have no idea what you're doing, we can try to shut them down. If there is a clear attempt to distinguish between them, the public will be more responsive, because we have evidence showing that they do respond to the fact that if people are more trained, among these people, those who are more trained tend to get, the public is willing to pay them more and value them more. So I think that there is a way to make these people much more integral part of the system, test them, make them, train them, make them more competent, but don't pretend that they don't exist. Because if you pretend they don't exist, you can't actually get them to do anything. And the key is to get them to do anything, and in particular not to do some things, like use new generation of antibiotics. This is a problem we could solve, because we know basically that you can walk into any shop and ask for the most recent generation of antibiotics, and you can buy it. You know, all of you know you've done it. That should just not be possible. And it's easy enough to shut down. You can just send people pretending to try to buy them, and if somebody sells it to you, shut down the store. I don't think that I think we claim to be wanting to be a harder state. In one place where if I wanted us to be a harder state is in dealing with this antibiotic resistance, which will kill us if we don't do it. So switching gears again, another topic. Jobs. This is obviously the one that's on the front burner. Education and health, nobody really talks about much. And this is where everybody agrees. We're not creating anything like the jobs we need. And there is a sense in which, yet, that if you talk to people in industry, they'll tell you that we can't get the labor we want. They say we are a labor scarce economy. It's expensive to get good workers. How could those be? How could our labor cost be high, even in white-collar jobs? White-collar jobs is where we have very little employment protection. People will talk about our labor laws, but the labor laws apply only exclusively to blue-collar. We have a large organization, Poverty Action Lab, so I know something about labor laws in this country, and we don't have very restrictive labor laws for white-collar employees. You know, unions of specific companies, some organizations might have imposed some rules, but there are no protection for white-collar employees is pretty weak here. So how could it be that we are both labor abundant and labor scarce? And the answer is, and so before I get to the, people, this is something we are aware of. We talk about Make in India, we talk about get into the global supply chain, rationalize labor laws, improve infrastructure, reform the banking sector, ease of doing business. I think there's a lot of truth in these. These are all good things to do. I have no problem with any of these. They're all good things to do. But I think there's a couple of, but it doesn't explain why there's a perception of labor shortage. We have to somehow square the fact that these are all supply side factors. These will make demand for labor go up. But why would people feel that there's not enough labor? Well, two things are going on. One is labor force participation among women is low, among the lowest in the world, and falling. That's one thing that's happening. A second thing, which is less emphasized, and is in this graph. I don't know if anybody, those of you at the back can see it, but it tells us a very striking story, which is that if you take the people who have more than 10 years of education, so 10 years in school, at age 26, 20% of them are not working. Okay? That's not because there are not enough jobs, because anybody, essentially everybody, every male with less than 10 years of education is working at the same age. So the men are, without 10 years of education, so those who have less education are working. Those who are more than 10 years are not working, but at age 32, they're all working. Our unemployment rate among males of age 32 is 2%. So everybody's working. So it can't be that those guys, there's jobs for those guys, but just for the men in the 20s, there's no jobs. It's because they don't want the jobs. We are offering them jobs that they don't want. That's the part of the labor supply problem, is that we are offering people jobs that they don't want. Firms that want to get trainees to come and learn on the job at age 20, but somewhat educated people can't get them because they don't want those jobs. As a result, turnover is high, work attitudes are bad, training is wasted. We evaluated a training program where there were 550 odd trainees who were trained, who were enrolled in a program, the government subsidized program. They went through the program. At the end of 6 months after the program ended, 37 of them were working in the jobs that the program they had trained in. That's 7.5%. So, training programs fail because people actually, and we asked them, why don't you want the job? They said, we don't like those jobs. That's why our labor is expensive. And the source of the problem is that people really want government jobs. So if we ask people, what jobs would you like? This is from a survey in Rajasthan. And essentially, the median answer, the mean answer, etc., well, all government jobs. People want government jobs. The ideal of what a job is a government job. It's a job that's well paid and which has, no very strong obligation to work. This is why the idea that everybody is going to become an entrepreneur is also not going to work. Government jobs are very cushy. Private teachers make about a quarter of what public government teachers make, less often. Their benefits, leave, lax hours. 28 million people, 2.8 crore people applied for 90,000 low-level railway jobs. And these kinds of numbers you see all the time. 300,000 applying for 27 jobs. And this is not an accident. This is because this is by far the most attractive thing. So people would rather take competitive exam after competitive exam and not engage with the labor market. And then after 30, basically they're not eligible to take these competitive exams anymore. They've taken it too many times, so they start taking jobs, and therefore they're employed. At the same time, so this is we have a labor supply problem. We also have a labor demand problem, as I said, and I think this we are not going to fix. The kind of jobs people want, which are well-paid jobs with benefits, we're not going to create enough of them. I hate to be a Cassandra voice, but I don't see any way we're going to create the number of jobs we want. We talk a lot about job creation, how important it is, but to 100 million, 200 million good jobs, nobody's creating 200 million good jobs. I mean, that's the population of many countries, and we're not creating 200 million good jobs. It's not happening. And the jobs people want are good jobs, which are too cushy. But even normal jobs are not about to grow that fast. Partly, I think I mean, this is the Exim Bank, so let me make a small point about trade. Labor costs are a tiny fraction of delivered cost of a good. So when you look at a toy that's sold in the US for $10, what fraction of that is labor costs? 50 cents? So if I cut the labor cost by dramatically, 50% to 25 cents, how much did I save on the price of the good? 25 cents. Now, and you are now a new supplier going into the world market trying to sell something for $9.75 instead of $10. You're not going to go anywhere. It's just, I don't think we are about to become hugely more competitive in low-skilled manufacturing. It's just not going to change very much. I don't think of us as, so I think we should think of it as being, this sort of story that we're going to, massively expand our manufacturing exports. It's just not going to happen. Where we might make more progress is in the domestic market, where we have, partly because it's still pretty fractured. We could, I think, do much better. We function somewhat like a closed economy in some ways. But I do think that the idea that we are going to become China's the next China seems unreasonable, and I don't think it's happening. Given that, what can we do? Well, I think we could do some things. We could do our best to make it easy to create jobs. I think some special economic zones that are not boondoggles for the real estate sector would be a good idea. Plug in access to land, transport, environmental clearances. I'm going to suggest something that is, I think, particularly, most people react so negatively to, but I think it's on both sides in a sense. I want to think we need more government jobs and make them much less cushy. So my proposal is we start an apprenticeship program for government jobs. So make it mandatory. For all government jobs, you have to do 5 years of apprenticeship, and it's up or out. You know, if you get them, if you are good at the job, you keep it. If not, you leave. In the apprenticeship, you are paid only what an apprentice is paid. Some flat rate, 10,000 rupees a month. I mean, since these guys are doing nothing, after all, they're applying for government jobs and sitting at home. Pay them 10,000 rupees and say, if you don't do this apprenticeship, you won't get another job. And use the qualification in that job as a requirement for getting a permanent job. I think this will change the attitude towards government jobs. It'll free up the labor market because people will realize that it's no longer, they can't just take a test, they have to do something to get the job. It's going to, and it will get them started much quicker. They get the experience benefits. They're going to work longer. Their work life will go up by 20%, 30%. Finally, take away people's chances to take 1 million government job exams, competitive exams, 2, 3, 5, set a limit and say you have to do it within 2 years of each other. After 2 years, you're done. You can't take it, spend your entire 20s taking exams. This will cut the cost of government jobs at the entry level, makes it possible to hire many more people. The government needs, we are under-governed, our government is too small. You go to a Chinese village, there are 10 people with BA degrees in a village. We have 0. The median number or in the government of a village is 0. And so we expect to be competitive, but we don't really have the infrastructure of the ground to be competitive. Get people who have real skills on the ground, and get people get experience and reduce the obsession with getting government jobs, because at that point it's not so cushy, not so easy to get a job. You have to work hard. Continuing on this kind of diatribe on how we should do social policy, social protection. Our social protection is designed against around 2 programs, NREGA and PDS. Both are targeted towards the poor. They are not targeted towards a large group of people, increasingly large group of people, and this is one of the examples of a success. The very poor are now a small part of our economy. The people who are subject to very large shocks, but are not the poorest of the poor, are a very large part of the economy. You see all these, farmers' movements and other movements, and these movements are a reflection of the fact that there are lots of disgruntled people, but who are not very poor. They are kind of, middle farmers with some land who have now big economic problems. And I think we have to start by recognizing that these people are also legitimate claimants on the social protection. Or we'll get very many angry people who are going to be protesting because they want a quota, they want a particular inclusion into particular government programs, etc. And we're going to be constantly managing that. We need to start by saying, yes, you have real problems and we can do something about it. The current response to this is piecemeal bailouts, loan write-offs, expanding reservations until, I guess they'll include everyone eventually, that will sort of take their teeth out. Inefficient subsidies with disastrous consequences, fertilizers, power and water is a real crisis now. Look, in Punjab, they're trying to stop people from planting rice till the rains come, and it's a huge battle that's going on there because the water table is very low. We need to, and likewise, we are not able to somehow deal with the burning of stubble in Punjab and Haryana, which pollutes all of North India. So these are all issues where we are, because we are not able to deliver to people, we are also scared of taking something away from them. I think there are lots of shocks beyond individual control and need to be insured in some form or the other. Shifts in world prices, the weather, they have other shocks. We actually are man-made. I think our inflation targeting regime has built in right now, the way we do it is if petroleum prices go up, we have to find something to make prices go down. How do we do it? We hit agriculture, essentially. We ban exports, we import goods even if there are large surpluses, so we take it out on agriculture. That's a completely unfair way of functioning and will create anger. And we won't be able to manage the anger. Right now, we have a Fasal Bima Yojana, which doesn't seem to be working very well, partly because it's not very well designed. But and I think that it's quite hard to do, because you have to know who is a farmer, how much did he produce, how much would he have produced if you had not given him the insurance, etc. It's not easy to do. So I propose a new social compact. The government acknowledges that it imposes large costs on specific groups in pursuit of overall efficiency, and that some of these shocks are beyond individual control. It sets up a mechanism for identifying these groups based on where they are located and what they produce, not based on what they actually did, but if they are this is a block that produces a lot of sugarcane, this block deserves, when we take a policy which makes sugarcane less profitable, we compensate them. Geographical identification is much more robust than individual identification. We create a national body for paying compensation. We have the JAM Trinity that the government set up, so we have some machinery for doing it. We should use it better. Last topic I want to say something about is urbanization. We're urbanizing extremely fast, in a sense, partly because we don't call it urban. A lot of our urbanization is villages of 12,000 in UP. That's a village, but there is no city in the state of Montana in the US with 12,000 people. So this is, we call them villages, therefore they're villages, therefore we're not urbanizing. But in fact, what we are getting are really bad infrastructured cities. Cities which have no governance mechanism for an urban agglomerate, and we have don't have the resources to build infrastructure. We are getting many small cities which are very, very bad quality. And that's something that is a disaster in the making. And because once you build around, if you grew up like me in Kolkata, you know that if you build a neighborhood which was built for the native population and was never given the idea, that was not based on the idea that it was supposed to have good roads in there, it's exposed, you can't build roads because you're stuck. So I think we need to think very hard about the way we are doing urbanization. Current approach is not really is neglect. We talk about resources, which we don't have, and the political impossibility of implementing the 74th Amendment, which is the implementation of the equivalent of a Panchayat Raj in cities. We're really facing disasters from all sides, unlivable cities, mounds of trash that have nowhere to go, and no water supply or sewers. This is much of now rural India has getting there, because these are really, we call them villages, but they're cities, and we don't give them the city infrastructure. The 74th Amendment is key, because we need good people. We need city managers who are actually real professionals who are managing these cities. And they need resources and control to deal with issues. We need cities to borrow and do so within a federal framework, and sell land strategically to raise resources, and collect real estate taxes. This is the way cities work in the world. And if we don't do it, we're not going to invent some, there's no magic here. There's a certain set of ground rules, and we are following none of them. So let me conclude. We've done well, even surprisingly well, given as a country, given the many constraints we face. This is why we now face a different set of constraints. Our cities our villages are turning into cities partly because people are now buying cars in villages. Lots of cars. You go to many villages, there are tons and tons of cars, but no roads. And that's a problem we need to deal with now. Likewise, people are now getting lifestyle diseases, partly because they have a lifestyle. They're not starving anymore. This is a particular mindset change we need. We need to deal with them, or they'll pull us down. And we can do it, I think. The real problem is we need to sort of start thinking about it now as something that we have no choice but to deal with. And if we did, we could do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Banerjee, for delivering Exim Bank's 34th Commencement Day Annual Lecture. We will shortly be commencing with our panel discussion, followed by the question and answer session. Just a gentle reminder, ladies and gentlemen, to ask a question to the speaker, you may visit Exim Bank's Facebook page and post your questions below the live feed. You may also ask the questions by using #EximCDAL34 on Facebook or Twitter. The most relevant questions will be posted to the speaker for answering. Request you all to kindly bear with us till we set up the stage for the panel discussion.